Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. This is going to be the second video in the immigration series that I started in the previous video, applying property rights to the question of immigration. In this video, I'm going to cover one of the objections, or one of the ways some libertarians try to get around the whole property rights argument against immigration, and that is welfare. So I'm going to cover some ways that people talk about welfare with respect to immigration, and I'm going to examine and explain why these do not follow as far as justifying the prevention of people moving across national borders in immigration terms. So first off, one thing I hear a lot of people say, a lot of libertarians say, is that, well, yes, I would be for open borders, or I would be against restricting immigration, if not for the fact that we don't have a property rights-based system and welfare exists, or that if we met those criteria, if we had a property rights-based system, and obviously welfare wouldn't, as it exists now through the government, being done through government taxation to support it and provide funds for it, then yeah, I would be for it. I wouldn't have any issue with free immigration. So let's examine this a little bit. The idea that if only we had a private property rights-based system where welfare did not exist. So the first part of that implies the second. Obviously, if property rights are being respected and enforced, then there would be no government welfare. But the problem here is, as explained in the first video, being able to cross a government border is simply an execution of one's basic property rights. So it's not something that is contingent upon some other condition being met before you can do it. It's something people have the right to do right now. You can't just say, well, we need to fix all this other stuff and then we can get around to allowing people to walk across government borders. No, the problem is that people have the right to do it. Period, stop, full stop. They can do it. They have the right to do it. And to put it another way, when someone says, well, I would like to, when we have a private property rights based system, well, being able to freely immigrate across government borders is part of having a property rights based system. So in order to bring it about, you have to have free immigration. So you can't say, well, we can't have free immigration because we don't have the system. Well, you're not going to have the system until you have free immigration. That's part of the conditions of having a property rights-based system. Government borders disappear. So you can't use that as justification for preventing it. And let's examine this argument a little bit further. What if somebody in the 1800s said, well, you know, slavery, slavery is wrong, but we can't get rid of it until we have a property rights-based system in place. We can't get rid of it until then. Would any libertarian take this argument seriously? Or at least I would hope that they wouldn't, because it's preposterous on its face. The elimination of slavery is itself an implementation of private property rights-based justice, similarly to how the elimination of government borders is itself an implementation of private property rights-based justice. Well, maybe that example is a little bit extreme, so let's bring it to something a little more current and a little less extreme than talking about slavery. What if somebody said, well, you know, normally I would be for the private ownership of automobiles and that people should be allowed to purchase them and drive them. But until we get rid of public roads, then we can't have that. We need to outlaw the ability of people to purchase and drive automobiles. Again, when you apply these arguments that are used against immigration to other areas, it becomes obvious that they're fairly preposterous. No libertarian would take seriously anyone who said, yeah, we need to have the government step in and prevent people from privately owning automobiles because there's public roads and we can't have people using public roads. We need to get rid of the public roads first before people can be free to own and use automobiles. That would not be taken seriously, and rightfully so. It's on its face ridiculous. People have the right to own automobiles and use them because they have the right to do with their property as they wish. So this argument does not make much sense when viewed through the lens of property rights-based justice. So there are other arguments that people who try to use welfare as justification for restricting immigration. Typically, it goes along the lines of outlining various negative consequences of government welfare programs, say cultural degradation, increases in crime, the fact that the government taxes funds from people to implement these programs, and so on and so forth, which obviously taxation is a criminal act, and thus overall there is an increase in the number of rights violations by the government due to welfare. The problem with this is that these are arguments against welfare itself, not necessarily free immigration into the country. It's perfectly reasonable for somebody to enter the country but not access welfare. So the fact that somebody is crossing a government border in and of itself does not relate to welfare. Another thing is, it's also very important to keep in mind what the actual rights violations are. So the government will tax resources from people, which again is theft, and then it gives it to these other people. So the government doesn't actually own the resources that it taxes from people, but what crime are the recipients committing? They're not stealing the funds from anyone. They're simply taking stolen funds from a thief. That in and of itself isn't a crime. The crime that's being committed is the government stealing the funds from the domestic population. So it doesn't follow that the welfare recipients are committing a crime against the domestic population by receiving welfare. And also, let's say, for example, let's concede all that. Let's just say, well, you know what? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that receiving welfare from the government is a criminal act. I don't agree with this, but let's say, for the sake of argument, that it is. So what does that justify? All that justifies is the prevention of welfare programs, the prevention of people taking welfare funds. So the correct conclusion to this is that, well, okay, this is a criminal activity that they've got going on here. We need to stop it. We need to stop welfare. It's not an argument for the act of walking across a government border, because that act is not related to the act of taking welfare. Again, the fact that you've entered the United States does not necessarily follow that you will take welfare funds. So even if we concede that accepting welfare is a crime, which again it is not. The actual crime is the theft via taxation from people. Even if we accept that it's a crime, all it justifies is the prevention of the execution of the welfare programs. And another very important point here is this argument applies equally well to the domestic population as it does to any immigrant population. So if we're going to use the assumption that a given category of people, which we're going to term immigrants, may sometimes use welfare programs, and that this is a criminal activity, therefore we're going to prevent them from living in the country, then obviously we need to apply this to the domestic population. Therefore, the domestic population should be deported because the domestic population uses welfare. So once you view it from that lens, it doesn't make any sense. It simply, I mean, you're pretty much talking about a justification for preventing people from executing their property rights that can be applied to everyone in the country equally, but you're only selectively using it as an argument against one particular class of people. So in that sense, it's a completely arbitrary standard that is being used with respect to the use of welfare as an argument against people being able to immigrate into the country. A related argument is that by using welfare, the immigrant population gives the government justification to expand its power or to expand those programs and necessarily increase the number of rights violations upon the people within the country. So if you look at it this way, this is an automatic justification for, again, getting rid of everybody in the country. Because when you look at programs other than welfare, say, like I mentioned earlier, public roads or schools or anything the government does which anybody utilizes is therefore a justification for the government to expand its tyranny upon the population by increasing its size and therefore increasing its level of taxation upon the domestic population. So any use of any program, any government program by anybody, if you accept this argument, is therefore justification for deporting that person. So again, when you select, these arguments are only selectively applied to immigrants. They aren't actually universalized. Obviously, simply using resources from a thief, or taking resources from a thief, or utilizing property that was, for example, a public road that was built via funding through taxation, that is not the criminal act itself. The criminal act was the theft by the government. So again, that in and of itself is not a crime that you can legitimately use force to prevent people from doing. Using the public roads is not a crime. The crime was, again, the taxation. But even if you accept the argument that utilizing welfare in and of itself is a crime because it gives the government justification to increase its size and therefore its tyranny upon everyone, then you must apply this to every government program in existence, and therefore the argument applies to everybody within the country. And if your argument is, well, we have to prevent people from entering the country because once they're here, they're gonna use these programs and the government's gonna get bigger and everything's gonna be awful, well, then you have to apply this to the domestic population, and you've just justified picking them up and tossing them over the border so that they can't so that they can't take advantage of these programs. Another related thing is that sometimes people say, well, again, the government gets bigger because the more people that immigrate into the country, this allows the government to become larger. And therefore, a government program, the government, a larger government is worse than a smaller government. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the government is more tyrannical, because the argument only applies as a ceteris paribus, or all other things being equal argument. So the best way to illustrate this is through an example. Let's compare North Korea to the United States. And where I'm going with this is that this argument is simply pointing out that governments that govern over larger populations tend to be bigger than governments that govern over smaller populations, which doesn't tell us anything vis-a-vis whether that government is more or less tyrannical as far as the amount of rights violations it is committing against the people that live within its borders. So if you compare the government of North Korea to the government of the United States government is far larger than the government of North Korea. But this is because the government of the United States has purview over greater than 300 million people, whereas North Korea, I believe it's around 20 to 25 million people. But does that tell us anything as far as whether the situation in those two countries is better or worse as far as government tyranny goes? I'm fairly certain everybody would agree that North Korea is a far more tyrannical country to live in as opposed to the United States. So the mere fact that we look at these two governments and determine government A is larger than government B, therefore government A is worse than government B, doesn't necessarily follow as far as the amount of rights violations it's committing against the domestic population. So we can't accept this as a legitimate reason for preventing people from entering the country. It's simply a population issue. A bit of a corollary relating to the governments being bigger due to an increase in population. If you're going to take the argument that anything that prevents the government from becoming bigger or shrinks the size of the government is good, therefore we should prevent immigration, well, why don't you just advocate, again, deporting people from the United States? That would certainly, if you deported enough of them, just US citizens, that would eventually at some point decrease the size of the government. Or maybe you just think, well, only people that utilize government welfare should be subject to this. Therefore, we should not allow immigrants into the country. Well, then why don't you say that anybody that goes on welfare within the United States or any other country should be deported? And again, because the population is a major factor in the size of the government, where the larger the population, the larger the government tends to be. I mean, why stop there? Why don't we just execute people? I mean, if you execute people, then the government would be smaller because it would have a smaller tax base to steal resources from. So why not just justify it that? Why isn't that justified? Well, obviously, the reason why these things are not justified is because they violate people's rights. It violates people's self-ownership, and it violates their private property rights. So you can't just use the fact that the government might get bigger or smaller as a justification for any old thing, because there are many things which violate people's human rights, their self-ownership and property rights, that could actually reduce the size of the government. So how do you select amongst those things? Well, you select those things which don't violate people's rights. So maybe you're saying, okay, well, I don't want people murdered. That's ridiculous. Who wants that? Well, again, as explained in the first video, government borders are illegitimate, so people have the right, through their right to self-ownership and private property, to walk across them. So because they have this right, it's a violation you can't use the government shrinking. You can't use the fact that the government might be smaller by preventing them from walking across the border as justification for preventing them from walking across the border, because preventing them is a rights violation. Similarly to, you can't use the fact that the government would be smaller based on the fact that if we killed half of the people in the country, the government would shrink, because killing half the people in the country is a rights violation. So you can't justify, you can't use the size of the government as justification for those actions. It only applies, it's only a loose guide as far as looking at things, because again, all other things being equal, yes, a government that taxes less and spends less is better than a government that does not. But that's assuming that there is no further increase in the number of rights violations that it is committing. If in order to shrink the size of the government, you have to increase the number of rights violations against people, then this act is not legitimate. It is not a proper way to reduce the amount of tyranny, because you've necessarily increased it. So this, again, this argument simply does not follow. And I'd also like to continue to point out that many of these arguments against immigration are completely arbitrary and selective, in that they could be applied equally well to the domestic population, or when select programs such as welfare are used as justification against immigration, that the argument could apply equally well to any other government program, and therefore everybody should be deported. So again, the arguments are very selective and pretty much arbitrarily applied. So in conclusion, we can see that welfare is not a justification for restricting immigration. The only way that it can, for example, reduce the size of the government is through further rights violations. So you cannot use a rights violation to prevent people from executing their rights, and therefore welfare can't be used as a justification for preventing immigration. And again, just to sum up, all of these arguments that people use are selective and arbitrary with their application to immigration, and could be applied to everybody. But again, for some reason, they simply don't use them against other government programs or the general population as a whole. So in conclusion, welfare cannot be used to justify the restriction of immigration. So I hope this explains things a bit more. And I will move on to another topic in the next video. Most likely I'll be discussing the issue of public property and those arguments that people use relating to public property as justification to prevent the immigration of people into the country. So I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.